Good evening. I am Sophie Torney and I'm a member of the Lighter Footprints Forest Working Group. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to recognise their continued connection to country and to thank them for caring for and protecting the land, the river, our beautiful forests since time immemorial. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that to all First Nations people in the room tonight. I'd like to make a special welcome to the federal member for Kooyong who's here tonight, Dr. Monique, who you will hear from in a little bit. And to welcome you all here for a very special event. I don't know if you remember, but on the morning of May the 23rd this year, there were text messages beeping across Melbourne that there was to be an announcement that day to the end of native forest logging across Victoria at the end of this year. It was pretty amazing. And you might have heard a kind of a whoop of celebration across the state. The extraordinary activism, the protest, the research and the science, the advocacy, the legal cases, and the sheer dedication for decades had succeeded. And I can see from the many faces across this room tonight, people who've been involved in this huge movement to end native forest logging. So we did celebrate, but after the celebration, there was time to pause, to reflect, and to grieve for what we had and what we'd lost. Victorians' precious forests have been decimated. The journey to protect them has been long, and yet there's much more to be done. So tonight we're privileged to have Professor David Lindenmayer, Sue McKinnon and Aawa White, three speakers whose combined experience and expertise offer great insights into the current state and the future of these forests and what needs to be done to safeguard and protect them. Their stories embody the potent impact of science and research, long-term monitoring and legal action, and citizen science in forest prevention, and they'll each present their own perspectives. So, first up we have Professor David Lindenmayer. He is a world-leading expert in forest and woodland ecology, resource management, conservation science, and biodiversity conservation. He has maintained some of the largest long-term research programs in Australia, with some exceeding 40 years in duration. He's among the world's most productive and most highly cited scientists, particularly in forest ecology and conservation biology, and he's published 1,418 scientific articles, including 906 peer-reviewed papers in international scientific journals, as well as 48 books. He is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, the Ecological Society of America, the Royal Zoological Society, and a Fellow of the American Academy of Sciences. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2014, and his research has been recognised through numerous awards, and in 2018 he was awarded the prestigious Whitaker Medal from the Ecological Society of America. David Lindenmayer.
Well, thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Monique. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. This place is actually very close to where I grew up as a kid. The first movie I ever remember was at Baldwin. Wheels Across the Wilderness with the Leyland brothers. So what I wanted to do for the next 25 minutes is do two things. One is to give a little bit of a background to the state of the forests as they exist at the moment, and then some perspectives on restoration. And this really is a recovery challenge to undo what's happened in the last 6 to 7 decades across the state. So just to give you a little bit of background, in the last 25 years, we've lost nearly 80% of old growth in the state, nearly 80%. We've seen huge areas of regeneration failure, not only after recurrent fire, this is in northeastern Victoria, but also extensively in logged areas. So what you can see here are small numbers of trees coming up on recently clear-felled areas, and this is not uncommon. This is about 30+% of all logged areas across the state. Some background, a wood production forest has somewhere between 32 and 38% of its area that has not regenerated where trees used to be. We've also seen extensive losses of biodiversity. Now, not everything is declining. The mountain brush-tailed possum is relatively stable. The common ring-tailed possum is actually increasing, but many of the other species are declining and declining quite dramatically, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. The other thing that's really important in this context is that the size and the frequency of fire is increasing quite dramatically across Victoria. And we see a very steep change from about 2000 to 2020 relative to 1980 to 2000. A huge change. And that's published. So there's no doubt about what's happening with fire. We see that some places are burning 3 or 4 times in the last 25 years that should burn only once every 75 to 150 years. So there's some really serious thinking to be done about what's going on. Why are things changing? One is the climate's clearly changing. There's no doubt about that, and the link to fire is quite clear. We also know that log forests are more flammable, and we'll come to that in a minute. But the other thing that's starting to emerge is that some kinds of hazard reduction burning can actually make forests more flammable than less. That's a bit of an own goal. So here's a little bit of data from the Black Summer Fire footprint across 2 states, Victoria and New South Wales, broken into 2 parts of New South Wales. This is what the data shows, is that a logged forest always burns at higher severity than an intact forest, always. And that logged forests burning under moderate fire weather still burn at higher severity than intact forests burn under extreme conditions. So the difference that's created by logging in these forests is really quite marked. And so that effect lasts for between 40 and 70 years after the forest has been regenerated. It's quite a problem. So what are we doing about these really extensive flammable forests that have been made more flammable dating back at least 70 years? Some people are saying, let's get out there and thin the forest. Well, let's have a look at the data. So we looked at the data after the 2009 fires and then in a separate analysis after the 2019-20 fires. And the answer is that thinning either makes very little difference or in some cases it actually makes the forest more flammable than it was before. So thinning is not the answer. What about hazard reduction burning? Now, this is a very complex topic. We're going to skate across it. But one of the things that we've discovered more recently, this is some work led by Phil Zylstra from work done in Western Australia. Western Australia does more hazard reduction burning than just about anywhere in the world. And what Phil was finding is that, yes, hazard reduction burns seem to be effective for about 5 to 7 years after the burn has been done, but then it increases. So as the understory is rejuvenated by the fire, what we see is that there's an increase in the risk of high severity fire for up to 50 years. And there's an effect that's very large relative to long unburnt forests. This is in Western Australia, but it's quite possible that we're going to see similar kinds of things in our systems. I think some very important take-home messages here about the complexity associated with prescribed burning. So we'll come back to that. This is what Phil's data show in terms of this hump-shaped curve. It's actually very similar to what we see after logging. After logging, there's this hump in terms of the increase in the risk of fire severity, which then declines. The important thing about hazard reduction burning is it's the quality that matters, and high quality hazard reduction burns are done very close to people and property, because that's the thing that you want to protect, people and property. It needs to be done every few years. And if we get involved in hazard reduction burning in very remote parts of Victoria where people don't live, that's going to be an own goal. It's actually also a waste of public money. And it's also important to realise that in many circumstances, under extreme conditions, hazard reduction burning doesn't work. And Marysville is a rather sad example of this. So when you next are listening to your shock jock on Sky that says, if we'd done more hazard reduction burning, none of this would have happened, Have a think about this place. This is Marysville, where I used to live. In December 2008, you couldn't see in front of your face because of the amount of smoke associated with hazard reduction burning. So within 8 weeks, that town was razzed. So it's important to understand that there are limitations to this approach. So if we now think about what the challenge is that we've got to regrow the amount of old growth across Victoria, and that's where fire severity is at its lowest ebb. The second thing that's important is that we have extensive areas of failed forest regeneration, and we've got to work really hard to be able to put a lot of that regeneration back. The trees have got to be put back in place. We've got to restore the natural fire regime, and that actually means that some places in the landscape shouldn't burn. Tall wet forests and Gondwanik forests are actually really important places that don't burn. First Nations people often call these no fire country for good reason. We need to focus our hazard reduction burning in places where it really matters, protecting people and property. And as we're going to talk about in a minute, we've really got to do a lot of work to recover iconic species, and the greater glider is one of them. So this is southern greater glider. It used to be 1 species, it's now 3, and it may be more. And it really is an extraordinary animal. Something that we've worked on for a very, very long period of time. And it's like a small gliding koala. It actually doesn't move much in the forest, and it's got very bright eye shine, so it's actually a wonderful animal to be able to spotlight. But it's also very vulnerable. It's what we call a sentinel species. It doesn't like land clearing. It doesn't like logging. It's sensitive to fire. It's actually sensitive to hazard reduction burning as well, because it's very heat sensitive, which also means that it's sensitive to climate change. And once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away, when I was a young person, it was the most common animal that you would see in spotlight surveys. Now it's endangered. So this is the kind of place that greater gliders love. This is a patch of old growth forest, and you can see a photograph of me in there. I'm in the little red jacket. Amazing forests. This is an hour and a half from where we are tonight. Extraordinary places, and it's where we have big populations of remaining greater gliders. But they also love big old trees, like this one. This was the Firmiston tree, which was close to Fernshaw. It collapsed pretty close to one of our sites just a few years ago. Greater gliders don't survive on log sites. They like old growth and they like big trees. That's not what you get on log sites. They don't like fire. And you can see the severity and intensity of the fire in this photograph. It's taken in Black Saturday. With fire, we see a big decline in their tree hollows, but also with hazard reduction burning tends to take out a lot of hollow trees as well. So we need to be very careful about where we apply those hazard reduction burns, because they can not only change the fire dynamics in forests, but they can take out really important parts of habitat. So these negative effects are really quite important. Hazard reduction burns that get too hot can kill greater gliders, just like in Western Australia, where hazard reduction burns killed most of the remaining population of the endangered western ringtail possum. So if we come back to the Central Highlands forests for our story of recovery, so these are forests not far from here, Marysville, Healesville, Warburton, places that I was at this morning. We have many long-term sites, and I've been working in these forests for a long time. So here's a photograph of me disguised as a much younger man. So we've been measuring these forests for a very, very long time, and we have a very large number of sites across these forests to understand where animals are occurring and why they occur where they do. And so we have very old forest, very young forest, log forest, intact forest, forest on steep slopes, etc., etc. And our greater glider was the most common animal that we used to see in these forests. Nearly 75% of sites had greater gliders when we first started working in July 1983. And since 1997, we've seen the number of greater glider sites and the number of greater gliders overall decline catastrophically, nearly 80% now. So this animal is in free fall. So these are real data. This is not modelled. This is counts of the numbers of animals on sites in the forest. And one of the key things is the big trees that these animals need to nest in and den in. The important thing about most of these animals is that they don't just occupy one tree. They move regularly between different trees as part of the arms race to stop them being chewed up by owls. All of the possums and gliders do this. And so forests that have lots of these really big trees are fundamentally important to the survival of these animals. What we see is that the population of these big trees is crashing dramatically. And we have measured this repeatedly since 1983. So that is the trajectory for the loss of these big trees. These are trees that take 170 to 400 years to develop. So what do we see? About a 90% decline in total abundance of these big trees by 2035. That's only another decade away. Old growth, which is where these trees are most abundant, has declined dramatically, as we talked about earlier. And now the old growth estate is just 1.16% for mountain ash of what we thought it was when white settlement first occurred. It's about 0.47 for alpine ash. And if you go back into the historical documents, which we've been doing in the last few weeks, you discover from about 1928 onwards, there were deliberate policies from the Forest Commission of Victoria to liquidate old growth. You can actually find that. And that existed right through to, for example, the Ferguson Timber Inquiry in 1985, liquidate old growth to move to regrowth forest. So you're liquidating a lot of greater gliders in the process. How are we going to recover this iconic animal? And it truly is a fantastic creature, amazing animal. So we've been studying where do these things occur in the forest and why they occur where they do. We know where the gliders used to be. Remember, we have lots of these large old sites with gliders on them. We've been tracking the gliders through time. We know where they used to be and where they're no longer being. Even just in the last couple of years, we've seen where they've disappeared. So these are fantastic places to think about recovery. Where are we going to put these animals back? How would we do that? We also know that the greater glider is very heat sensitive. We know this from heat chamber work that's been done at ANU. Overnight temperatures don't have to get very high and greater gliders don't have enough energy to feed. So we need to work out where is it coolest in the forest, because that's where greater gliders are going to be. So we can do that with more recent modelling, but we've also measured it and we know where the old forests are also the coolest. And we've also been working on the next generation of nest boxes. So how do we design nest boxes so that greater gliders don't cook in them during the day? Remember what a tree does. A tree not only fixes carbon, it actually takes water from the soil and it pumps it up through the tree to the top of the tree. In the case of mountain ash forest, nearly 100 metres off the ground. That water is actually a big insulative cooling jacket that keeps the hollows cool. That's what we have to replicate with these nest boxes. And we have to put them up high enough in the trees because gliders don't fly. They volplane. They glide from one spot to the next. They lose elevation as they go, climb up the tree and glide again. And the nest hollows need to be very high in the tree. So we've got to put the nest boxes up very high as well. So we've thought about all these things. Where did the gliders used to be? Where are the coolest parts of the forest? What sort of nest boxes do we need? Where do we need to put the nest boxes? So this is one of the most sophisticated and detailed thought processes in a translocation and reintroduction of any species. We've been looking at these things for years now to think through what we can do. So, for example, making sure that we've got the right insulative properties, that we've got the right paint, so that if there is a fire, the chances are that the gliders will survive because the nest boxes are relatively fire resistant. Which side of the trees are we going to put them on so that the animals don't get too hot? All of these kinds of things are really important for understanding what's happening. The other thing is that you can see the hollow is actually just big enough to allow a glider in, but not big enough for a competitor like a mountain brushtail possum. That's the dynamics of how hollows work. So these are glider-specific boxes to make sure that they work. And so then we have to go out and trial them. And we've trialled them in East Gippsland, we've trialled them in southeastern New South Wales, and they work. It's fantastic. Our approach is to bring this wonderful animal back using good science, using good support from people in the community, and building on the last 40 years of work to really try to make this a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That's brilliant. So now I'd like to introduce Sue McKinnon. Sue is a conservationist and the president of Kinglake Friends of the Forest. In 2022, Kinglake Friends of the Forest won a Supreme Court case against VicForests, which determined that VicForests had been carrying out widespread illegal logging over the Central Highlands. As a result of the case, the Supreme Court placed permanent injunctions on VicForests, and as a result of the injunctions, all logging operations were paused in Central Highlands. Kinglake Friends of the Forest is currently organising citizen surveys of the forest to locate yellow-bellied and greater gliders. They will continue to raise awareness of Victorian forests and advocate for forest management that is informed by science. For many years, you'll know Sue because she's been one of the key voices of the forests. I'd like to welcome Sue McKinnon.
The Kinglake Friends of the Forest and the Environment East Gippsland cases were heard together in the Supreme Court and became known as the glider case. The case effectively stopped logging in the east of Victoria, as Sophie has said, from November last year. For years before that, we'd gone out and we'd located greater gliders and recorded them and reported them in areas that VicForest was to log, only to see those trees that we recorded them in and the trees around them torn down and sent away to make paper. The case stopped that cycle of death and despair. The case confirmed that the government was lying to us. They said they were logging legally, they weren't. They said they were logging sustainably, they weren't. They said they were regulating logging, they weren't. We started the case in 2021, and massive appreciation to our barristers, Jonathan Corman and Kylie Weston-Schuber, and lawyer Kwabena Labi of Oakwood Legal. In court, we claimed that VicForest was flouting two clauses of the Sustainable Forest Timber Act. The judge, Justice Richards, in her conclusion said that these are the two clauses that we tried. We won on both of them, and Justice Richards said VicForest's current approach to detecting greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders is considerably less than clause 2.2.2.2 of the code requires, and VicForest is not applying clause 2.2.2.4 of the code in the Central Highlands. So VicForests have been logging illegally, not in one stand and not in one instance, but over the entire of the Central Highlands, everywhere they logged. And that's the patch there in Victoria. That's from Newgee in the south to Eildon in the north, and from Wallen in the west to the Bawbaws in the east. That's a close-up of that area. The white shapes show the area to be logged in the current logging plans, and the coloured shapes show the areas logged since 1940, which is important if you're a glider because trees take 80 to 200 years to form hollows. The Environment East Gippsland case found that VicForest has been logging illegally over the entire of East Gippsland as well. The case also tells us that this 100% state government-owned business was not just logging illegally, but logging unsustainably. So clause 2.2.2.2, which VicForest has been flouting, is known as the precautionary principle. This is not the exact wording, but it means effectively that where there's a risk of serious or irreversible environmental damage, you don't need 100% scientific certainty that that damage will occur before you must take measures to prevent it. The clause was included in many of Australia's laws after we signed the United Nations Sustainable Development Treaty in Rio in 1992. The precautionary principle is one of the fundamental principles of sustainable development in the Rio Treaty. Since VicForest was found to be non-compliant with the precautionary principle, its operations and product cannot be regarded as sustainable. Considering finances alone is an oversimplified interpretation of sustainability, but VicForests fails there too. Last year they lost $54 million as an example. Yet VicForests claims in its website and media releases that its operations and products are sustainable, even after VicForests' appeal was heard and rejected. A quick 5-minute look at their website reveals the word sustainable 50 times. Government websites such as these inform, or should I say mislead, consumers, purchasers, and can, if abused like this, provide an unfair market advantage. They inform or mislead teachers, students, media, artificial intelligence systems now and into the future. It's very important that we stop government lies from being published and force retraction of these lies. The government and the supposed regulator, the Office of the Conservation Regulator within DECA, ignored the result of a previous legal case, the Friends of Leadbeater Possum versus VicForests case. That also found that VicForests had been flouting the precautionary principle. But the federal court could not compel a state logging business to comply. A quick check of VicForests' own data showed that they did not modify their operations after that case. The Office of the Conservation Regulator should have stepped in then. Instead, we and other community groups had to take VicForests to the state court to get the law considered again and applied. In our case, the glider case, Justice Richards commented on this. She said the findings of the Leadbeater case might have been expected to prompt some reflection and adjustment of VicForests' approach, end quote. It is significant that instead of just handing down a declaration of law, of how the law should be interpreted in our case, Justice Richards made specific operational orders so that there was no wriggle room for VicForests. Any flouting of these orders would be contempt of court and answerable to the court rather than just the regulator. So finally, last November, VicForests was forced to abide by the law, to survey properly for gliders before they log and to protect them and their home ranges from destruction. It seems that VicForests isn't able to do this, so it stopped logging in the east of the state from that time. In May this year, the government announced the January 2024 end date for native forest logging. The announcement was not to end all native forest logging in Victoria, but just an end to that logging that's under the allocation order under the Sustainable Forest Timber Act. That's the white shapes in this map, if you can see those. The blue shapes indicate logging under the Forest Act of 1958, of which there has been no announcement. The take home from all this is that the government cannot be relied on to tell the truth, not just in election promises, but in concerted, continual barrages on glossy websites and in social and print media. What does this do for our democracy? What does it do for real responses to climate change? Can we believe government in regards to the environment, biodiversity, carbon and fire management? Right now, the government, again through VicForest Management, is planning to remove logs from trees that fell in storms in the Wombat State Forest. They claim this is to mitigate fire risk. This claim is obviously absurd. Logs do not burn in the fire front. The government's own fire hazard rating system specifically excludes logs from what they call fuel. The absurd claim has been repeated to justify logging in the Dandenong National Park. This claim has been tested in yet another court case against VicForests, initiated this month by Wombat Forest Care, the same barrister Jonathan Corman. In this case, the judge has said that she did not accept VicForests' argument that the planned operations were necessary to reduce fire hazard in the Wombat State Forest. I've come to the view that the evidence does not support that claim, she said. Kinglake Friends of the Forest is now focused on government's forest fire management. Hundreds of thousands of hectares are burnt every year in government planned burns. It claims it's making communities safer. Yet wildfire records reveal that planned burns only reduce fire risk for a few years, as has been previously said. After that time, the flush of shrubs and understory growth which come after a planned burn make the area more of a fire risk than before the planned burn. The government is also claiming that it has to thin forests to make communities safer. Yet research, as David has said, also shows that thinning in all but one category of forest either makes wildfires more severe or makes no difference. This research comes from assessing thousands of records of previously planned burns and thin sites and records of fire severity of wildfire in these sites. Is the government making communities safer or putting us more at risk? In their planned burns, thinning, log removal and breaks, is the government still lying to us about forest management? The IPCC repeatedly points to improved sustainable forest management as an effective form of climate mitigation. We must insist on the truth and science in forest management, not political expediency. In summary, I have 3 points. The government cannot be relied on to tell the truth with regard to forest management, including fire management. Please ask forest groups or scientists for evidence-based information. We are happy to share or have you join us. 2, forest management, including fire management, must be informed by science. And 3, community groups have a role to keep the bastards honest.
Thanks, Sue. That was absolutely brilliant. So now I would like to introduce our final speaker for the evening, Aawa White. Aawa's passion is forest. She is the main facilitator and trainer for the Kinglake Friends of the Forest citizen science work. She coordinates ongoing regular survey work and initiated and coordinated the mass survey, which attracted a huge media attention last October. Aawa is part of the survey training team for KFF, which last year ran several survey training events and a university placement program for ecology students. Aawa's written guides for surveyors are widely used. I'd like to welcome Aawa White to the stage.
Thanks everyone, and thanks Sophie and Sue and David. As they've all said, we've had some amazing wins in the last year, but there's also a lot of work to do. And I'd love to talk to you about how getting out there into the forest and gathering information as citizen scientists can be a really, really effective tool of resistance and also deeply rewarding. In one chapter of her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, First Nations American scientist and author Robin Wall-Kimmerer describes rescuing salamanders from a road that carves between where they spend their winter, hibernating in the forest, and the pools where they breed in spring. She says, "What is it that drew us to the hollow tonight? What crazy kind of species is it that leaves a warm home on a rainy night to ferry salamanders across a road? It's tempting to call it altruism, but it's not. There's nothing selfless about it. This night heaps rewards on the givers as well as the recipients. We get to be there to witness this amazing rite, and for an evening to enter into relationship with other beings as different from ourselves as we can imagine. A big part of being out in the forest is that sense of connection with other species. And we often have experiences similar to that Robin describes, also often by spotlight at night in the forest. But for us, the most frequent moment of connection is often, as David describes, those bright eyes shining back at us from the forest canopy, because greater gliders really do have incredibly bright eye shine. Sometimes you can see one 30 metres away just from the light of your head torch. So that's usually what you see on the left, just the eyes and that bit of the white belly and throat, and then if you've got a really good camera and a great photographer, you get that on the right. So for years, that moment of making eye contact with the glider was one of deeply conflicting emotions for us, because on the one hand, there was the wonder of encountering such an incredible being, but on the other hand, there was despair because we knew what would happen next. We would provide the government with the exact location of the glider using video and GPS evidence, and they would reply with something like this. And this is an actual excerpt of an email we got from the Department of Environment in 2019. So they said, "Thank you for your emails regarding timber harvesting at Coop Spyglass. Timber harvesting operations in State Forest is undertaken in accordance with the legislative requirements. Our interim assessment indicates there is no basis for ceasing timber harvesting. Sufficient habitat is being retained at Spyglass Coop that recognises the presence of the greater gliders, and areas of protection are being retained." And that's what Spyglass looked like after they'd finished with it. Is anyone surprised that they're now endangered? Unfortunately for VicForests and the government, the legislative requirements they referred to so smugly in that email actually turned out, as Sue said, to require VicForests to not kill the threatened species. And so for nearly 2 years, that moment of making eye contact with the greater glider through the forest canopy has been defined by wonder, as usual, but also relief and joy, because the glider has saved that area of forest. Other grassroots groups in the forest campaign have achieved similar results by connecting and collaborating with other forest species like the leadbeater's possum and tree geebung. But it's important to note that we're fully aware that protecting forests is not just about single species. It's about the whole ecosystem, climate, water, the list goes on. But our approach to citizen science is that it's a tool for making tangible change and getting real protections for forests. And as under-resourced, volunteer-run community groups, targeting surveys around individual species it seems a really effective way of getting those results. Most of the court cases run by community groups are based on two main things. There's the expert evidence from professional scientists like David, and there's the data from citizen scientists. The need to gather evidence for the glider case that Sue talked about has led to KFF developing a community survey program. We've needed to cover a lot of ground, and that's meant we've needed a lot of people. And to do that, we've worked together with members of other forest groups, but also individuals who have just reached out wanting to help. So this collaborative approach to surveying really kicked off for us with 3 nights over Christmas and New Year's in 2021-22 in a forest in Toolangi known to VicForests as Coop 297-501-0005, Castella Hills. We needed to prove to the court that it was possible to comprehensively survey this area because VicForests said it wasn't possible. Well, it was definitely rough terrain, but these are our tracks over the 3 nights, and all the flags and crosses and symbols are our glider detections. And there we are with some members of another group, Wildlife of the Central Highlands, who've done seriously hard yards for forests in citizen science for many years. This year alone, in the KFF survey program, we've surveyed 26 areas of forest with up to 5 surveys at each location, and with each survey, including people ranging from 2 to 30 people in each group. As Sue explained, since the announcement of the end of logging in May, we've turned our attention to planned burning. We've continued surveying for gliders, but we're now trying to upskill ourselves and our group of nearly 200 volunteer surveyors to learn about some endangered plants that grow in the burn areas. There's 3 of the ones we've been looking for and learning about. And really importantly, we've also been surveying for hollow-bearing trees, because we know that between 14 and 26% of these trees collapse during a planned burn or just after a planned burn. And hollow-dependent species like greater gliders, other gliders and owls are already deep in a housing crisis. So this is where we'd actually love your help. We have a petition calling on the government to abandon broad-scale burning of forests, and I think there's a QR code for that somewhere, at the front. But I think some of you, I think one between two, there's a guide for something called the Hollow Bearing Tree Challenge. So there's 5 steps in this guide, and I'll also just run through the slides that we've got here, and if you don't have the guide, you can maybe take a photo of the slides on your phone so you've got the instructions. Basically, the challenge is for you to find hollow-bearing trees, like a hollow-bearing tree. The challenge for the tree is to not collapse in a planned burn, and the challenge for the government is to listen to science, which seems very challenging to them. So, step 1, I get the vibe that many of you may have already downloaded iNaturalist at some point, but if you haven't, that's step 1. It's a really great tool, and it really is very helpful if you're not great at IDing things, which I'm not, getting you started on that process. Step 2 is to pick one of these locations, which are all adjacent to a planned burn area. And the planned burn areas are the shaded areas. Then go on a little walk. It can be as short or as long as you like. The first 2 locations actually can connect in a great loop walk, and find one hollow-bearing tree, or more if you like, of course, and take photos of it. Then, if you could upload your photos to iNaturalist, it's not usually what this app is used for, but I think it's going to work. It will suggest an ID, which you're welcome to take or leave. I mean, it weirdly did called Eucalyptus obliqua brown top stringy bark, which, messmate, I don't know where it got that from, but David, do you know? The government won't care about that anyway. Then once you've uploaded your photos, just make sure you do write in the note, hollow bearing tree. Then the final step is to click on that share icon, get the link for your detection, and send it to the Chief Fire Officer of Forest Fire Management Victoria, and also the Environment Minister. Tell them that you want that tree protected from the planned burn, and that you would like a reply to your email. That's an important bit. And if you feel like BCCing us into that, we'd be very keen to see what's going on out there. But yeah, have a go. And thanks very much.
Hello everybody, I'm Jan Malloy and this is Julia Croata, and we're from the Forest Working Group. Julia's also from ACF Boroondara. The first question that I'm going to ask, can you identify the key next campaign for policy change we should be supporting?
God, it feels like we need all of us fighting on all fronts. There's the ongoing logging under various guises, and there's the burning. A massive job for regeneration.
I have several things that I think are important. One is that I think there's a real need for more protected areas that are properly funded and properly managed. And I make that plea because it's very hard to then start logging national parks once you change the tenure. But I think we need to have better forms of management than we've had before. For example, co-management with First Nations people around parks. There is a good track record of that in other parts of Australia. It's the first thing. The second thing is the restoration challenge is massive. We've got literally tens of thousands of hectares of country that should have trees on it that doesn't. There's a good body of science to be able to support putting forests back into place where they used to be. I have a deep concern that VicForests is now going to walk away from the extensive areas that have not been regenerated properly. And I think there's also a real need to think deeply about targeted recovery of some of the things that have been badly damaged. For example, populations of greater gliders in the last 50 to 60 years. I think it's really important to understand that in many cases, the collapse of VicForests is not just to do with threatened species. There has been a history of overcutting in this state that dates right back to 1904. So if you look at some of the early commissions, for example, in the Wombat State Forest, 1904, the forest was already overcut then. Right through, so the problem is one of massive overcutting. It has not been sustainable for more than 100 years. And so we have a lot of work to put these systems back together again. Restoration of entire ecosystems, restorations of populations, thinking about tenure change and how you manage these things properly. And I think the hazard reduction, burning, fire management thing also really needs to be looked at. We're spending a lot of money on things that probably have limited return on investment. You know, kilometres and kilometres, hundreds of kilometres of fire breaks. There is not a lot of evidence that these approaches work. We have a very limited window for hazard reduction burning. We should not be burning in really remote areas. We should be focusing it in a small number of areas where it really matters for people and property, and rethinking the way that we're applying high severity, high intensity, broad scale prescribed burning that is not getting us to where we need to get to.
What role can the national environment laws play in protecting endangered animals and ecosystems?
National environment laws are really important because at the moment the regional forest agreements trump the EBPC Act, which is madness. The regional forest agreements are actually agnostic as to where they get their timber from, so they can source timber from plantations, for example. So the latest ABARES data suggests that at the moment Australia is exporting 97% of plantation pulpwood logs, eucalypt pulp logs overseas. It is insane. We actually need to be retaining more of the timber that we grow in Australia and processing in Australia for Australian jobs, not exporting most of our plantation resources overseas. It's crazy. So the national laws really do need reform, and they need to take into account the history that we've seen through all the successful court cases, not only in Victoria but in New South Wales and elsewhere, to indicate some of the deeper seated problems with the legislation as it currently exists.
All right, so this is addressed to you, David, but I think Sue and Aawa, you can both have a go. Can you tell us what the most effective way to prevent bushfires is then, given that it's 200 years for old growth forests to grow back?
The first thing is that severe fire weather is actually a climate effect. So one of the key things that we need to address is actually a global challenge, and that is to do something about climate change. You know, the data are overwhelming through what's called attribution studies, that the likelihood of some of the severe fire events that we're seeing not only in Australia but around the world are very unlikely to occur in the absence of climate change. The serious issue of tackling climate change is really a serious issue, and that actually means not opening more coal mines and gas fields. So we also know that there is a land management issue underneath that, and we know that logging makes forests more prone to high severity fire. The data are unequivocal, but it's not just us that's finding this. The University of Wollongong, the University of Tasmania are finding the same thing. We need to cease native forest logging, because if it wasn't just for the emissions that's produced or for the effects on the environment, because of its effects on the safety of human communities. So we now have a fire burden that's created that's going to last between 40 to 70 years. So what else are we going to do in this space? The other thing that we have to do is that we have to think about what new technology can do for us in terms of detecting ignitions much more quickly and helping us to suppress fires much more quickly as soon as they ignite. The best way to tackle fires is soon after they're ignited. So there are new technologies to start to look at that. ANU's been doing some really serious work, particularly our engineering people, our lightning strike modelling people and others, about how can we effectively use new technology to help us with drone fleets, water gliders and other things to detect fires quickly and extinguish them. The estimate is about $42 million to set up those kind of networks. That would be a fraction of the insurance bill at Mallacoota, Cobargo, Marysville, you name the number of towns in that space. I think there needs to be a cost-effective analysis as well. I'm completely unconvinced that broad-scale, large fire breaks that can actually add to the changes in microclimate are going to be effective. I think we can spend that money much more effectively in a better targeted way. You need to remember that many people in these organisations are actually working off knowledge that they gained at university that might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's not always keeping up with the latest thinking in terms of what's going on in this space. Now, I think if we invest in some of this new technology, that potentially creates new industries for Australia, for other countries to be able to deal with this, be it Greece, be it Hawaii, all sorts of other places are going to be facing the same problems as we are. One really important factor in this is that only Portugal globally loses more of its wood production forest to fire every year than Australia. It is not possible to run a sustainable timber industry with that level of recurrent fire in the system. That is really important to understand. So in the last fires in 2019-2020, southern New South Wales lost 80% of everything that was planning to cut in the subsequent 5 years. In East Gippsland it was nearly 60%, and statewide it was 30%. You can't run an industry when those kinds of fire regimes are taking place.
Is the Great Forests National Park even a remote possibility, and why is it so hard to achieve?
Why is it so hard to achieve? You need to think about the dynamics of what happens here. So you have some of the best lobbyists for industry that you can imagine. So if you go to Canberra at the moment, every sitting week, I was talking to a colleague of Monique's just yesterday, every sitting week you will see Joel Fitzgibbon in Parliament House, ex-Shadow Agriculture Minister, who is now the CEO of AFPA. Every single sitting week, almost every day, they're in Parliament House. Who else is there? The head of the CFMEU. Who is the biggest donor to the ALP in the last election? Go and have a look at the Grattan Institute. It'll tell you who it was. So as Ben Chifley said, if you're going to have your money on something, make sure it's the horse called self-interest. And that's the sort of set of issues that we're dealing with at the moment. Both sides of politics are actually stitched up in this space, and you actually need independent thinking, independence in Parliament to push the dial on this to move us. And I'm not saying this just because Monique's here. It's actually true to see a different set of perspectives on things that are not captured by either side of industry. That's really important. So the reality for the Great Forest National Park, I think, is critical, but it needs a different management model than we've had before, and it needs to be discussed and managed in concert with First Nations people around the tourism opportunities, the carbon opportunities, the water opportunities, the employment opportunities in this space. I've just spent 4 weeks on enforced leave in Africa. They do the whole guide process, the field guide process for people to be guiding others around in the forest and elsewhere. You have to go to a college, you have to be certified to even be able to do that. Australia's about 30 years behind in this space. So there's whole sets of industries here that are not being realised because we're still stuck in the 1970s style forest wars with the CFMEU and AFPA and others stitching up these things. That has to change. We have the opportunity, if we stop native forest logging in Australia, we reach our 43% target, plus with a 14% fossil fuel offset. There you go. There's one of the simple solutions, but we need to do a lot better than just that. We need to go not carbon zero, carbon neutral. We need to go carbon negative, and we need to do it very quickly.
Well, I'll address this one to the activists. Can you identify the key next campaign for policy change we should be supporting?
I mean, look, this maybe is not that straightforward, but my experience as a forest activist is that you just got to try everything, and you don't know what's going to work, and you just got to give it a go, and it leads somewhere, or sometimes it doesn't. But when we first started spotting for gliders, it was that despair thing, but we felt like we needed to know where these animals were, and one thing led to another. So I think all these issues we've talked about so far, pushing in various directions, if everyone uses their imagination and ingenuity to come up with ideas and gets their friends behind them or people they like to work with, then something will give, and then that gives energy to a campaign along that avenue.
I agree. It takes all... sometimes we ask ourselves, well, what's the important thing to do? Well, just do that. But it just seems to be everything. Protesters bring education and media and widespread knowledge. If it wasn't for protesters in forests, we a lot of you probably wouldn't know that there was logging. And then scientists bring the information that we need. Citizen scientists bring the masses of data that we need. Legal cases are great, education, days like tonight, and just open avenues. Just please connect with us. Please don't just take the government's word for granted.
I actually think there's obviously many things to be involved in. One of the things that I think is important is to watch out for environment grief, because there's a big diet of negative news, and I think it's really important for people to actually go out and experience being in the forest and being with other people that like being outside. That's for me, that's very important. So that's from a personal perspective. From a policy perspective, I think we have to do something very serious about carbon methodologies, because at the moment what's happening is that there's a lot of dodgy things happening with offsets. There was a paper published last week showing that almost all large-scale global corporate offset programs are actually greenwashed. That was published in Science last week. So we need to get the guardrails right to make sure that we can get this carbon storage thing sorted out in forests. So that means to get over the bullshit that if we cut forests down and regrow them, that'll be good for the climate. Let's park that as being absolute rubbish at the moment. Remember that 90% of everything that gets cut in native forests in Australia goes to the woodchip paper pulp stream. Okay? That has a very short period in the carbon life cycle before it goes to landfill and then goes to emissions, let alone the emissions that are created when you cut the forest in the first place. Remember those times in autumn when you guys are eating and drinking and breathing industrial smoke pollution that comes from burning slash on log sites, 450 tonnes of it in some cases. So the whole carbon methodology thing needs to be sorted out, and so that it's not gamed. That is really important. It's going to be a long time before Australia is off fossil fuels. I get that we have to bring no more mines into the process, but I think one opportunity to bring a large amount of money into the forest space is through carbon. And I think carbon storage is really important. And it is really important to be across the concept that there is a difference between carbon sequestration, which is the rate of accumulation, and carbon storage, which is the total amount stored. One is a stock and the other one is a flow. So that's important to be across that. And I think there's a lot of work to be done federally to make sure that we get these carbon methodologies sorted out so that we can make some real changes which don't entail planting trees in deserts which grow when it's wet and die when it's not. So there's work to be done in that space, in the legislative space, but also I think in the advocacy space to take us to a better place than where we're at the moment.
But can you compare traditional approaches to landscape management and use of fire, and talk about whether there are any traditional owner groups currently practicing traditional methods which are helping landscapes to recover?
Okay, that's an incredibly complex question with about 50 different nuances on it. I think it's important to be aware that there is a narrative that Australia's forests at the time of white invasion or British settlement or whatever you want to call it, there's a notion that Australia's forests were open and park-like, that you could ride a horse through them. Okay? It's important to understand that that is not the case in tall, wet forests and Gondwanic forests. We're writing something on forest history at the moment. The early explorers' accounts, Strzelecki, Tuckey, Broadrib, human hovel, all indicate that tall, wet forests and Gondwanic forests were incredibly dense and incredibly wet and mostly old growth. Okay? The best book that I've seen written on this is by an author called Haitley from 2004. It's called The Victorian Bush. That underscores that conclusion. That is not the same for the drier, much more open foothill forests and the woodlands and grasslands in Western Victoria, where there is a clear case of strong evidence for Indigenous folks having a big impact on the structure and composition of those systems. So the notion that Australia was burnt regularly by cultural fire right across the landscape is beautiful and simple, but it's actually not right. From what we have seen from photographs, from paintings, from early explorer narratives, and actually the fundamental ecology of how the forest works in the first place, including some of the species that we've talked about tonight. Leadbeater's possum is an understory specialist. If you apply regular cool burns to these wet forests, which is not possible anyway, but if you were to remove the understory, then you don't have Leadbeater's possum. It would have been gone 40 or 50 or 60,000 years ago. Okay? There are places where cultural fire is really important, no doubt about it, across many parts of Australia, but you need to remember there was over 300 different nations that applied fire in different ways to different environments, and men and women burnt country in different ways for different reasons. So the complexity is substantial in this space, so beware of simple narratives. I think it's really important to be across that. Repeated fire in tall, wet forests, we've already seen systems collapsing where you have repeated fire in these circumstances. Are there places where cultural fire has been applied appropriately? Yes, there are. Some of the inland temperate woodlands in New South Wales, there are experimental studies now going. There are some parts of Northern Australia where cultural fire has been deployed with reasonable success. It's a big topic, but you need to be really careful about simplistic outcomes in this space. You also need to be aware that cultural burning is not the same thing as industrial hazard reduction burning. They're not the same. Remember why First Nations people were burning country. They were burning country for a whole range of reasons, very, very few of them related to asset protection. It was to do with small burns, often associated with bringing up green pick to bring animals in to feed on that green pick. When you do that, you don't burn over large areas. Remember the energetics of this. You want to bring your animals into a small area and then hunt them. We see this in our own data at Buddaree National Park. You see concentrations of macropods around areas that have recently burnt. When you have large-scale fires, animals are everywhere. You can't hunt them. Same with women burning country for things like Murnong, same kind of thing. So please think about things critically when you hear these kinds of things, and when you hear fire experts on Sky News talking about if only they'd done more hazard reduction burning, please engage with these kinds of things because, as my father used to say, they may well be victims of immaculate self-deception.
And on that note, I think we're going to need to stop the questions. I hope that you all got something out of the question time. I know I did. There's a comment here from Jim who says, take a battery pack when using iNaturalist as it can chew through your power. So those of you who are keen to get out there using iNaturalist, just remember that.
Federal member for Kooyong, Dr. Monique Ryan, has been an incredible advocate for the environment, for climate and for ending native forest logging. She's currently working on amendments to the EPBC Act to end native forest logging across Australia, which is awesome, and recently has been named the Australian Conservation Foundation Champion of the Greater Glider. So I would like to welcome Dr. Ryan onto the stage to launch a very special project with Professor David Lindenmayer.
I have to apologise. My team's let me down hugely today. I asked one thing of them, which was that they provide me with a Greater Glider suit to wear. I went overseas for a week. I came back. There was no suit. I was very, very unhappy. But let me also acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I hope that we will give those people a voice to our Parliament on the 14th of October. Let me also apologise on behalf of all governments, great and small, I completely agree with everything that's been said today. But let me tell you, David, that my Christmas present to you is that I will be putting up some amendments to the EPPC Act early next year, which is kind of a wasted effort because we're going through next year massive revisions to the EPPC Act, which is the Environmental Protection, Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's a massive, massive piece of legislation which basically looks at species conservation, but also a whole lot of different environmental issues on country and sea country as well around Australia. Massive piece of legislation. We were hoping to see it in the first half of this year. It's been massively delayed. It's been split into a number of tranches as well, so we will probably be debating the legislation in 4 or 5 lots next year. But it's still worth, I think, putting up a specific native forest amendment, basically to take the RFAs, the regional forest agreements, away from the states, and for the federal government to assume responsibility of something which is really, really important and should never have been given over to the states in the first place. So we'll do that next year, but we'll also talk about that when the new EPPC Act comes to town and hopefully in the first half of next year. But the other thing I'm doing before Christmas is introducing a lobbying act to limit the actions of lobbyists in Canberra so that we know who they are, who they're meeting with, what ministers they're talking to, what they're talking about when they're having those meetings with ministers, and to stop the revolving door of people going straight from government, either whether it be senior public servants, and we've heard a bit about that this week, but senior public servants or politicians going straight into the industries that they've been working with and protecting over the years prior to their move into private industry. So that will be this year as well. I think one of the things we've learned in the last few years is that you can have effective citizen scientists are incredibly important, and as a citizen politician I rely very much on the advice of the experts, and it's been one of the great pleasures of becoming a politician in the last 18 months is meeting the scientists who are working on incredibly important areas like this. So without further ado, David, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Monique. So there are several housing crises, and there is a housing crisis in the forest. And it's a housing crisis that we've been measuring since 1983. We know in Australian forests and woodlands, the housing crisis is particularly acute because Australia has more species of cavity-dependent animals than anywhere else in the world, proportionately. And what that suggests is that Australia was once largely old forest. And we've seen such a decline in old forest, but also a massive decline in hollows. And we know that it's a key driver of the collapse in populations of greater gliders. So we've been concerned about this not just for 1 or 2 years, but for many, many years. And so now what's happened is that we've decided we need to do something about it. If we're stopping logging, then we need to think about restoration. And if we're thinking about restoration, the most important thing for greater gliders is finding the right homes for them. So we've been designing nest boxes for these animals for several years now, and then trialling them, and we've been able to show that they work. So much so that female gliders that are using nest boxes actually now are emerging with back young, which is fantastic. That's something special to see. And so that means that we're now ready to start to tackle this problem in the mountain ash forest. We don't tackle it in the alpine ash forest because greater gliders don't live there. There's something different about the leaves, which means that greater gliders don't eat them. So leaves are really important in the life of greater gliders. That's all they eat. And the nutrient levels in leaves are really important. So the other thing I forgot to mention is that we've had to map the nutrient landscape for greater gliders to work out where the best places are going to be. And so we've done that. We've got the plan in terms of where to put nest boxes, how to put them up in trees, how many we need to put out, where they need to be juxtaposed relative to little patches of old forest where we've got gliders. So this is a chance to start on this road to restoring greater gliders. So that's the initiative. It's a pretty exciting one, and we're hoping that people might be keen and interested to maybe buy a nest box, and then we'll put them up and monitor them. And then if people want to come out to the forest, which is only an hour and a half's drive from here, you can actually see what your nest box has done to start the recovery process. We have to monitor it scientifically to be sure that we're having success. That's what we've done really badly in the environment space in the last 20 or 30 years. We've spent lots of money but haven't really been able to see whether it's working. In this case, we're going to make sure that it does. We want to engage the community, we want to engage volunteers, work with other groups and really show how it can be done and make sure that this is a success. So that's the program. I think it's a pretty exciting way to start this restoration process, to undo the damage from the last 50 or 60 years.
So on this piece of paper, which was on your seat, you'll find that there's a QR code on the back, bottom right corner.
Got to attach it very high, and we're also planning to put little cameras on the nest boxes so we can see who's coming in at what time. We know that within the first week we're going to get a bird called the owlet nightjar. Owlet nightjars check out every new hollow that gets put in, but won't be long before greater gliders take over, we hope, if we put them in the right places. So we want to be able to monitor that with cameras as well, so we need to be able to put the boxes up. It's no mean feat to put a nest box 15, 20 metres up in a tree, I can tell you, especially when they weigh 14 kilos, which is why I didn't bring one with me tonight in my luggage from Canberra. I'm sorry about that. We've got some challenges and some costs involved. Getting the nest boxes constructed through the men's sheds, making sure they've got the right thermal properties, the right paint so that animals don't cook inside them, they don't die if there's a fire, all those kinds of things. So that's the background science to make sure that this really is not only citizen science but also the technical side of it works.
So what would you expect the lifetime of a nest box might be?
Nest boxes built like this should last somewhere between 8 to 10 years minimum, and probably longer. With the ones that we've had up for 3 years are showing no signs of wear at this stage, which is great.
If you were to support buying one, are there ongoing costs, maintenance fees or things? Not
maintenance fees with the design that we have. In the past, we used to get bees and ants and wasps. With the proper design, we can now exclude those. And the only other cost is a logistical cost, which is bringing teams of volunteers out to help us do the counts on the sites where the gliders are. The cost of a box is about $200, and that's heavily subsidised mostly by ageing grey men in men's sheds. And all we have to do is go and give them talks, and they love this stuff, and we've taken them out into the forest, and it's pretty special. It's a good way. It's another aspect of community engagement, people getting involved in things, and it's part of the entire community being involved in the restoration process.
Yeah, I've got a vision of every primary school having one and having a sense of ownership about doing something effective to change the environment for these little creatures.
Do you have a camera on every box?
No, you have them on a subset of boxes to give you a representative sample of what's happening in areas. So we need to design this experimentally. The cameras are relatively expensive. We don't need to put cameras out on all boxes for all the time. It's a sample to try to work out what's happening. Yeah, and we will have occasions where we will take greater gliders out of nest boxes and do some other checks, some of the blood and haematology, animal health, those kinds of things. And if you've ever handled a greater glider, they're amazing animals. The first thing they do when you handle them is that they pee on you. But if you only eat eucalypt leaves, it smells like concentrated eucalyptus oil. And when I used to have a watch band, a Velcro watch band, it got peed on by a greater glider when we were handling gliders. And every time I rode my bike in, it would volatilise all the things, and I would have essence of greater glider. So, yes, sorry, that's a bit out there. Sorry about that. Someone said that there's and people in my office have had that webcam thing on the falcons in the buildings, and so the suggestion is that we need to get that going with greater gliders as well. The comment was around the interdependency of different species. And so my first job working in these forests was on leadbeater's possum. But I quickly realised that you needed to understand how the other species are working in these forests, and then you need to understand how the forest itself functions and how it responds to fire, how it responds to logging, how it's responding to climate change, and how the interdependencies actually change as time goes on as well. So, for example, we see that greater gliders and ringtail possums don't get on. They don't tend to co-occur, even though they're quite closely related on our sites. So that has actually been changing as we see the decline in the numbers of big old trees in these systems. So we've been thinking deeply about making sure that the nest boxes are going to be suitable for gliders, but not so much fun for common ringtail possums.
So I think it's a really good time now to thank everybody who has been up here tonight, our three amazing speakers, Sue, Aawa and David. If you could come up here, I've got a little gift for you. And also to Dr. Monique Ryan, been fabulous as well.